Mark Harper had always dreamed of running his own workshop, a place where he could restore and customize vintage cars, blending the beauty of classic designs with modern technology. After years of saving, planning, and hard work, that dream became a reality. He found an old industrial warehouse on the outskirts of town, a solid structure with enough space to house a fully equipped workshop. The location was perfect, quiet, spacious, and away from the main streets, making it an ideal place for his clients to bring their prized vehicles without worrying about prying eyes. The industrial zone had once been bustling with factories, but over the years many businesses had shut down, leaving the area relatively empty. For Mark, this wasn't a drawback, it was an advantage. Less traffic, fewer distractions, and more focus on his craft. Business had been going well. Word spread quickly among vintage car enthusiasts, and soon, Mark's workshop became known as the go-to place for top-quality restorations. His clients were loyal, and his calendar was always full. Despite working long hours, Mark loved what he did. Every car he worked on told a story, and bringing those stories back to life gave him a sense of purpose and pride. Things changed when a new residential complex was built nearby. What was once a quiet industrial zone turned into a developing neighborhood. The complex attracted wealthy residents looking for spacious apartments with modern amenities. At first, Mark didn't mind the changes. He even thought that having more people around might lead to new business opportunities. After all, some of the residents might be car enthusiasts who would appreciate his work. But it wasn't long before the problems began. One of the first signs of trouble came in the form of minor inconveniences. The newly built complex had limited parking spaces, and some residents began parking their cars along the streets leading to Mark's workshop. It wasn't a major issue at first, just a couple of cars here and there parked for a few hours. Mark figured it was temporary, maybe the result of visitors or deliveries. However, over time, the problem grew worse. More cars appeared, and they stayed longer. Soon, the area in front of his workshop became a makeshift parking lot, with vehicles constantly blocking the entrance. One resident, in particular, stood out: Stephen Miller. He owned several luxury cars, which he frequently parked outside Mark's workshop without permission. Unlike some of the other residents who at least made an effort to park out of the way, Stephen seemed to have no regard for Mark's business. He would leave his cars parked directly in front of the entrance for hours, sometimes even overnight, making it impossible for Mark to move cars in and out of the workshop. Mark tried to handle the situation calmly at first. He approached Stephen politely on several occasions, explaining that the parked cars were interfering with his work. Each time, Stephen either brushed him off or gave a half-hearted promise to move the cars soon. Despite his growing frustration, Mark didn't want to escalate the situation. He valued peace and didn't want unnecessary conflict with his new neighbors. He hoped that, with time, Stephen would understand and stop parking in front of the workshop. Unfortunately, things only got worse. One day, Mark arrived at the workshop early in the morning, only to find that the entire driveway was blocked by 3 of Stephen's cars. He had an urgent deadline. A client from out of town was coming to pick up a fully restored 1967 Mustang, a project Mark had been working on for months. With the driveway blocked, there was no way for the client to access the workshop. Mark tried calling Stephen, but his calls went straight to voicemail. He even knocked on Stephen's door, but there was no answer. With no other options and time running out, Mark made a decision. He called a tow truck. It wasn't something he wanted to do, but he felt he had no choice. He had given Stephen plenty of warnings, and now his business was being directly affected. When the tow truck arrived, Mark directed the driver to remove the cars blocking the driveway. Within an hour, the entrance was clear, and Mark was able to prepare the Mustang for the client's arrival. Later that afternoon, Stephen showed up at the workshop, visibly angry. He demanded to know why Mark had towed his cars and accused him of overreacting. Mark remained calm, explaining that he had tried to contact Stephen multiple times and had no other choice. Stephen didn't care. He warned Mark that this wasn't over and stormed off. Mark hoped that would be the end of it, that Stephen would finally understand and stop parking in front of the workshop. But deep down, he had a sinking feeling that things were far from over. The next morning, Mark found a letter taped to the front door of his workshop. It was an official-looking document. Stephen had filed a lawsuit against him, claiming that Mark had illegally towed his vehicles, causing damage and financial loss. The letter demanded compensation for the alleged damages and threatened further legal action if Mark didn't comply. For a moment, Mark just stood there, stunned. He couldn't believe what he was reading. How could someone be so unreasonable? He had every right to have the cars towed. They were blocking his property and interfering with his business. Realizing that this was a serious matter, Mark knew he couldn't handle it alone. He contacted a lawyer who specialized in property disputes and explained the situation in detail. The lawyer listened carefully, then told Mark something that made his heart sink. Stephen's lawsuit, though baseless, could drag on for months, costing Mark both time and money. Worse still, the lawyer pointed out that Stephen might not be acting alone. There were rumors that the developers of the residential complex had plans to expand further into the industrial zone, and Mark's workshop was standing in the way. If they could create enough pressure, they might be able to force him out, clearing the way for new construction. Hearing this, Mark felt a mix of anger and determination. He had worked too hard to build his business from the ground up, and he wasn't about to let anyone take it away from him. He decided right then and there that he would fight back, no matter what it took. He knew it wouldn't be easy, but he was ready to stand his ground. This wasn't just about a few cars blocking his driveway. It was about defending his livelihood, his dream, and everything he had worked so hard to achieve. The letter that Stephen had taped to Mark's door wasn't just a simple threat. It was an official lawsuit notice, drafted by an attorney and filled with legal jargon that made Mark's head spin. According to the document, Stephen was claiming that Mark had no right to tow his vehicles because the driveway leading to the workshop wasn't entirely private property. He argued that the road had been built decades ago on what was now considered a shared easement, meaning it could be used by the public and neighboring residents. The lawsuit demanded compensation for damages to Stephen's cars, loss of income, and emotional distress. On top of that, it also stated that Mark had violated local ordinances by calling a tow company without proper authorization. The last part stung the most. Mark knew he had done nothing wrong. Yet here he was being dragged into a legal battle over something that should have been simple common sense. Frustrated but determined to handle the situation correctly, Mark immediately called the lawyer he had spoken to previously. They arranged a meeting later that day. As he sat in the lawyer's modest office, Mark laid out all the details: the ongoing issues with Stephen parking in front of his workshop, the repeated warnings he had given, and his final decision to tow the vehicles after being ignored. He handed over the lawsuit notice, and the lawyer scanned it with a thoughtful expression. After a few moments, the lawyer leaned back in his chair and sighed. "Here's the thing," he said, setting the papers down. "This isn't just about some neighborly dispute over parking. Stephen is using this lawsuit as leverage. He knows dragging you into court will cost you time, money, and peace of mind, even if his claims don't hold up. He's betting on the fact that you won't want to go through the hassle of fighting it out, and if the rumors about the developers expanding further into this area are true, he might not even be the one behind all of this." Mark's brow furrowed. "What do you mean? You think someone's putting him up to this?" "It's possible," the lawyer replied. "Developers can be aggressive when it comes to acquiring land. If they've got plans for this area and your workshop is in the way, they might be trying to pressure you into selling or moving. A long, drawn-out legal battle could be part of that strategy." Mark felt a surge of anger rising in his chest. He had poured everything he had into this workshop, turning an old, forgotten warehouse into a thriving business. The thought of being pushed out by wealthy developers who didn't care about his livelihood made his blood boil. But he forced himself to stay calm. He knew losing his temper wouldn't help the situation. "So what do we do?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "For starters, we'll respond to the lawsuit," the lawyer said. "I'll draft a formal reply denying Stephen's claims and asserting your right to tow the vehicles. But beyond that, we need to gather evidence to back up your case. Do you have any documentation showing that the driveway is part of your property?" Mark nodded. "I have the original lease agreement for the workshop. It includes a map of the property boundaries." "Good. Bring that in as soon as possible. We'll also need any photos or video footage you might have of Stephen's cars blocking the entrance." The more evidence we have, the stronger our case will be." Mark agreed, and after finalizing a few more details, he left the lawyer's office feeling slightly more hopeful. He knew the road ahead would be difficult, but at least he wasn't facing it alone. He had someone on his side who understood the legal system and could help him navigate the complexities of the case. Over the next few days, Mark focused on gathering everything he could to support his defense. He found the lease agreement and property map, which clearly showed that the driveway was part of the warehouse's lot and therefore private property. He also went through his phone and managed to find several photos he had taken over the past few months of Stephen's cars parked in front of the workshop. In some of the pictures, it was obvious that the vehicles were blocking the entrance, making it impossible for anyone to drive in or out. While Mark was busy preparing for the legal battle, the tension with Stephen continued to escalate. On one particularly busy afternoon, a delivery truck arrived at the workshop with a shipment of parts Mark had been waiting for. As the driver tried to back into the lot, Stephen's car was once again parked right in the middle of the driveway, blocking the entrance. The truck driver honked several times, but no one came out to move the car. Frustrated, Mark had to help the driver unload the parts by hand, carrying each heavy box across the lot because the truck couldn't get close enough to the building. Later that day, Mark confronted Stephen again. He walked over to his neighbor's house and knocked firmly on the door. After a few moments, Stephen answered, looking as smug as ever. "We need to talk," Mark said, trying to keep his tone civil despite his irritation. "About what?" Stephen replied, leaning casually against the doorframe. "You know about what? Your car was blocking my driveway again today. I had a delivery and the truck couldn't get in because of you." Stephen shrugged. "It's a public road. I can park where I want." Mark clenched his fists at his sides, resisting the urge to say something he might regret. "It's not a public road," he said firmly. "It's private property. I have the documents to prove it." "Well, if that's true, then let's see what the court has to say," Stephen said with a smirk. "Until then, maybe you should think twice before towing someone's car again. You wouldn't want to make things worse for yourself." With that, he shut the door in Mark's face. Fuming, Mark walked back to his workshop. He knew Stephen was trying to provoke him, but he refused to take the bait. He had a business to run, and he couldn't afford to let personal grudges get in the way. Despite his resolve to stay focused, the situation began to take a toll on Mark. The stress of the impending legal battle, combined with the ongoing disruptions caused by Stephen, made it difficult for him to concentrate on his work. He found himself constantly on edge, wondering what Stephen would do next. It didn't help that some of his clients started to ask questions about the lawsuit. Word had gotten out, and people were curious about what was going on. Mark did his best to reassure them that everything was under control, but deep down, he knew the situation was far from resolved. Meanwhile, Mark's lawyer continued to work on the case, gathering evidence and preparing for the first court hearing. He filed the formal response to Stephen's lawsuit, denying all allegations and asserting Mark's right to tow the vehicles. He also submitted the property map and lease agreement as evidence, along with the photos Mark had provided. In addition, the lawyer requested a preliminary hearing to address the issue of whether the driveway was private property. If they could prove that up front, it would significantly weaken Stephen's case. As the date of the hearing approached, Mark couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this situation than just a petty neighborly dispute. He remembered what his lawyer had said about the developers potentially being involved, and he began to wonder if Stephen was being pressured or incentivized to make his life difficult. The idea seemed far-fetched, but in Mark's experience, when money and real estate were involved, people could do some pretty underhanded things. Despite the uncertainty and stress, Mark remained determined to fight back. He wasn't just defending his right to operate his business, he was standing up for himself and everything he had worked so hard to build. And no matter how tough things got, he wasn't about to back down. The morning of the preliminary hearing arrived faster than Mark had anticipated. Despite the sleepless nights and the weight of uncertainty gnawing at him, he pulled into the courthouse parking lot feeling a strange mixture of anxiety and resolve. His lawyer, Chris Donovan, had prepared him well, explaining how things would unfold and reassuring him that their case was solid. Still, the thought of facing Stephen in court, with a judge deciding whether or not Mark had the right to tow those cars, felt surreal. He had started this workshop with nothing but passion and hard work, never imagining that one day he'd be standing in a courtroom defending his ability to simply do his job. Inside the courthouse, Mark was struck by how cold and impersonal everything felt. The sterile walls and hard benches did little to ease his nerves. Chris greeted him near the courtroom entrance, offering a calm, confident smile. "You ready?" he asked. Mark nodded, though he wasn't entirely sure if that was true. Together they stepped inside. Stephen was already seated at the plaintiff's table with his lawyer, a slick-looking man in an expensive suit who exuded smug confidence. Stephen gave Mark a quick glance, his expression one of mild amusement, as though this were nothing more than an entertaining game to him. That look alone made Mark's blood boil, but he forced himself to remain calm. This wasn't the place for emotions. This was about facts, evidence, and proving he was in the right. The hearing began, and Stephen's lawyer wasted no time launching into his argument. He painted a picture of Mark as an aggressive, unreasonable business owner who had acted recklessly by towing Stephen's cars without warning. According to him, Stephen had been using the driveway for temporary parking, believing it to be a shared space, and Mark had overstepped his bounds by removing the vehicles without attempting to resolve the issue amicably. Mark listened in silence, clenching his fists under the table. The lawyer's words were twisted half-truths, designed to make Stephen look like the victim. When it was Chris's turn to speak, he calmly presented their side of the story. He began by submitting the lease agreement and property map, clearly showing that the driveway was private property, fully under Mark's control. He also pointed out that Mark had repeatedly asked Stephen to stop parking there, and that the towing had only occurred after those requests were ignored. To bolster their case, Chris presented the photos Mark had taken of Stephen's cars blocking the entrance on multiple occasions. The images spoke for themselves. There was no way any reasonable person could claim that Stephen's actions hadn't interfered with Mark's ability to run his business. Finally, Chris argued that Mark's decision to call a tow truck was not only justified but necessary given the circumstances. The judge listened carefully to both sides before calling a brief recess. Mark and Chris stepped outside into the hallway, where they waited anxiously for the judge's decision. Mark could feel his heart pounding in his chest. "How do you think it's going?" he asked quietly. Chris gave a small shrug. "It's hard to say. The judge seems fair, and we've presented solid evidence. If we can get a ruling on the property boundary today, that'll weaken their case significantly." After what felt like an eternity, they were called back into the courtroom. The judge reviewed the evidence one last time before speaking. He acknowledged that while disputes over shared spaces could be complicated, the documentation clearly showed that the driveway was indeed part of Mark's leased property. Therefore, Stephen had no right to park his vehicles there without permission. The judge ruled in Mark's favor, dismissing Stephen's claim of illegal towing and advising both parties to respect property boundaries moving forward. Relief washed over Mark as he heard the judge's ruling. They had won the first battle, but he knew the war was far from over. Stephen didn't take the loss well. As they exited the courtroom, he shot Mark a cold glare and muttered under his breath, "You're going to regret this." Mark ignored the comment, focusing instead on Chris's words as they walked to the parking lot. "This is a good start," Chris said. "But don't let your guard down. He might have lost today, but something tells me he's not done causing trouble." Chris's warning proved accurate sooner than Mark had expected. Over the next few days, the situation escalated in unexpected and frustrating ways. First, Mark received an official notice from the local zoning board, claiming that a complaint had been filed regarding potential zoning violations at his workshop. The notice stated that his business was operating in an area that might not be properly zoned for commercial use, and that an inspection would be conducted to determine compliance. Mark knew this was nonsense. His lease explicitly allowed for commercial activity, and he had gone through all the necessary permits when setting up the workshop. Still, the sudden inspection felt suspicious, too well-timed to be a coincidence. He immediately called Chris, who agreed to look into the matter. "It's probably just harassment," Chris said, "but we'll make sure everything is in order before they show up." As if the zoning issue wasn't enough, Mark also began noticing strange things happening around the workshop. One morning he arrived to find that someone had dumped a pile of broken glass and nails at the entrance, clearly intended to damage his tires. Thankfully, he spotted it before driving over it, but the message was clear: someone wanted to make his life difficult. Mark installed additional security cameras around the workshop, hoping to catch whoever was behind these acts of sabotage. He also started arriving earlier and staying later, keeping a closer eye on the property. Despite the growing tension, he refused to be intimidated. This was his business, his dream, and he wasn't about to let anyone push him out. Meanwhile, Chris uncovered some interesting information about the zoning complaint. It turned out that Stephen had filed it personally, claiming that Mark's workshop was creating excessive noise and pollution that disturbed the nearby residential area. While the complaint was unlikely to hold up under scrutiny, it showed just how far Stephen was willing to go to cause trouble. The day of the inspection arrived, and Mark was ready. He had all his permits and documentation prepared, and Chris was present to ensure everything went smoothly. The inspector, an older man with a no-nonsense demeanor, conducted a thorough review of the property. After several hours, he concluded that Mark's workshop was fully compliant with all zoning regulations. He filed a report dismissing the complaint as unfounded, much to Mark's relief. As they walked the inspector to his car, Chris gave Mark a satisfied nod. One more hurdle cleared. He's running out of ways to come after you. Mark wanted to believe that was true, but he couldn't shake the feeling that Stephen had more tricks up his sleeve. Sure enough, later that evening, Mark received an anonymous tip from one of the other business owners in the area. The tipster warned him that Stephen had been meeting with several local officials, possibly trying to find new ways to pressure Mark into leaving. The news only strengthened Mark's resolve. He had come too far to back down now. With Chris's help, he began preparing for whatever came next, knowing that as long as he stayed vigilant and kept fighting, he could weather the storm. The battle wasn't over, but Mark was determined to see it through to the end. Despite the small victory with the zoning inspection, Mark couldn't shake the growing unease gnawing at him. He had dealt with difficult neighbors before, but none had gone to such extremes to make his life miserable. It was clear now that this wasn't just about petty parking disputes. Stephen had a deeper motive, and Mark suspected it had something to do with the ongoing development in the area. Chris's earlier warning about developers possibly wanting to acquire his land kept playing in his mind. It wasn't just paranoia anymore, there was something coordinated about how quickly everything escalated after the initial towing incident. To get some clarity, Mark spent the next few days visiting the local municipal office, digging through property records, zoning plans, and development proposals. After several hours of searching and asking around, he found something that made his suspicions harden into certainty. A recently submitted development proposal from a large real estate company outlined plans for expanding the residential complex and converting the surrounding industrial area into a high-end commercial district. The problem? Mark's workshop sat right in the middle of the proposed site. The documents didn't list Stephen by name, but they clearly showed that he had some stake in the project. The proposal mentioned key stakeholder collaboration, implying that several property owners had already agreed to sell their lots to make way for the new development. Mark realized that Stephen was likely one of those stakeholders and was now trying to strong-arm him into giving up his workshop. If the developers could get rid of Mark, they would have a clean path to move forward with their project. Armed with this new information, Mark called Chris for an emergency meeting. When they sat down in Chris's office later that evening, Mark spread the documents across the table, pointing out the key sections he had highlighted. Chris listened carefully, his expression growing more serious with each passing minute. "This changes things," Chris said after a moment of silence. "If we can prove that Stephen's harassment is tied to this development project, it strengthens our case significantly. It shows that his actions aren't just personal grievances, they're part of a deliberate effort to force you out." "But how do we prove it?" Mark asked, frustration evident in his voice. "All we have are these development plans and a hunch that he's working with the developers." Chris leaned back in his chair, tapping a pen against the table as he thought. "We'll need more concrete evidence. The best way to do that is to figure out exactly what kind of deal Stephen has with these developers. If he signed any kind of preliminary agreement or memorandum of understanding, there might be a paper trail." Mark sighed, rubbing his temples. He was a mechanic, not a detective. The idea of digging through more bureaucratic red tape to uncover Stephen's connections felt overwhelming, but he didn't have much of a choice. He knew that if he didn't act, Stephen and the developers would keep piling on pressure until he either gave up or lost everything in court. Over the next few days, Chris filed several formal requests for public records, hoping to uncover any contracts or agreements related to the proposed development. Meanwhile, Mark focused on keeping his business running despite the ongoing tension. The workshop was busier than ever, partly because of the publicity surrounding his legal battle. Word had spread among the local car enthusiast community, and many people wanted to support him, bringing in their vehicles for repairs and restorations. While the influx of work was a welcome distraction, it also meant longer hours and more stress. As if things weren't difficult enough, Stephen continued to escalate his harassment tactics. One evening, after a long day at the workshop, Mark returned home to find a new letter taped to his door. This time, it wasn't a legal notice, it was a personal message, handwritten in large, blocky letters. "Sell now before things get worse." There was no signature, but Mark didn't need one to know who was behind it. The message was clearly meant to intimidate him, but instead of feeling scared, Mark felt a surge of defiance. He wasn't going to let Stephen bully him into submission. He called Chris immediately and informed him about the note. Chris advised him to document everything and report the incident to the police, which Mark did the following morning. While the police took his report seriously, they admitted there wasn't much they could do without direct evidence linking the note to Stephen. Frustrated but undeterred, Mark doubled down on his efforts to gather more information. He spoke to some of the other business owners in the area, hoping to find someone who might have overheard something or had dealings with the developers. Most of them were reluctant to talk, clearly afraid of getting caught in the crossfire, but one older man, who ran a small machine shop a few blocks away, eventually opened up. "Yeah, I've heard about those developers," the man said, glancing around nervously as if making sure no one was listening. "They've been sniffing around here for months, trying to buy up properties on the cheap. A few of the guys caved in and sold, but the rest of us are holding out. Rumor has it, Stephen's got a sweet deal lined up with them, something about getting a cut of the profits once the new district is built." This was exactly the kind of lead Mark had been hoping for. He thanked the man and relayed the information to Chris, who immediately began digging deeper into Stephen's potential financial connections to the developers. It didn't take long for them to find something useful: an online business registry listing Stephen as a partner in a newly formed investment group. The group's stated purpose was acquisition and redevelopment of commercial properties, and its address matched that of one of the developers listed in the proposal Mark had found earlier. "This is what we needed," Chris said, a triumphant note in his voice. "This proves that Stephen has a direct financial interest in forcing you out. We can use this in court to undermine his credibility and show that his actions are part of a coordinated effort to pressure you into selling." Mark felt a glimmer of hope for the first time in days. They finally had something concrete, something that could turn the tide in their favor. But Chris warned him that they couldn't get complacent. Stephen and the developers weren't likely to back down without a fight. Sure enough, just a few days later, Mark received another unwelcome surprise. Early one morning, as he was opening up the workshop, a team of surveyors arrived, claiming they were there to conduct a property assessment on behalf of the city. Mark immediately called Chris, who advised him to ask for documentation and refuse entry until they provided a valid reason for the assessment. When pressed, the surveyors admitted they had been hired by a private firm, one of the developers involved in the project. Mark felt his anger rising again. It was clear that Stephen and his backers were getting desperate. They were trying to find any excuse to discredit his ownership of the property or create new obstacles for his business. But Mark wasn't about to let them get away with it. With Chris's help, he filed a formal complaint with the city, accusing the developers of harassment and unauthorized attempts to interfere with his property. As the situation continued to escalate, Mark realized that this battle was no longer just about protecting his workshop, it was about standing up against powerful forces that thought they could steamroll anyone who got in their way. He knew the road ahead would be tough, but he was ready. He had come too far to back down now. With the support of his lawyer, his clients, and a few brave business owners who were willing to stand with him, Mark prepared himself for the next round of the fight, determined to see it through to the end. As tensions continued to mount, Mark found himself caught in a whirlwind of escalating pressure from Stephen and the developers. The harassment didn't just stop at the property assessments and intimidating notes. Over the next few days, things took an even more aggressive turn. One morning, Mark arrived at the workshop to find the large metal gate leading into his lot had been damaged. One of the hinges was bent, making it difficult to open. It looked like someone had deliberately rammed it with a vehicle. Furious, Mark immediately called the police, but as expected, there wasn't much they could do without witnesses or clear evidence. Chris, who arrived shortly after, surveyed the damage with a grim expression. "This isn't random vandalism," he said. "They're trying to wear you down. The gate's damaged, they'll send more complaints, and eventually they're hoping you'll just give up." Mark shook his head, his jaw clenched in frustration. "They can try all they want. I'm not going anywhere." Chris nodded approvingly. "Good, but we need to take action before they escalate further. We can't just react to everything they throw at us, we need to hit back strategically." They decided to file a formal restraining order against Stephen, citing the repeated instances of harassment and property damage. Chris explained that while it might not stop the developers entirely, it would at least force Stephen to keep his distance and discourage any direct involvement in future incidents. The restraining order was filed the next day, and within 48 hours it was approved by the court. Stephen was served with the paperwork, and though he didn't say a word when the process server handed him the documents, the smug grin he usually wore was gone. Mark took that as a small victory. But it didn't take long for Stephen to retaliate. Less than a week later, Mark received a letter from the city council stating that his business license was under review following multiple community complaints about noise levels and environmental impact. The letter warned that if violations were found, his license could be suspended or even revoked. Mark was livid. He knew these complaints were nothing more than a coordinated attack orchestrated by Stephen and his allies, designed to cripple his business. "Typical bureaucratic nonsense," Chris muttered when Mark showed him the letter. "They're using the city as a weapon to pressure you out. We'll handle this, but it's going to take time." The problem was that time wasn't on Mark's side. Every delay, every inspection, every baseless accusation drained his energy, resources, and focus from running the workshop. His loyal clients were still bringing in their cars, but Mark could tell that some of them were becoming uneasy. The constant presence of inspectors and the tension around the shop created an uncomfortable atmosphere that threatened to drive business away. Meanwhile, Chris started digging deeper into the nature of the complaints. What he discovered made things even more alarming. Many of the complaints had been filed by individuals who didn't even live near the workshop. Some of the names didn't match any local residents, and others appeared to be completely fabricated. This suggested that Stephen, or the developers behind him, had gone so far as to create fake identities to lodge these complaints. Armed with this information, Chris drafted a formal response to the city council, pointing out the suspicious nature of the complaints and requesting an independent investigation into their legitimacy. While the response bought Mark some time, it didn't stop the developers from trying new tactics. One evening, as Mark was locking up the workshop, he noticed a black SUV parked a short distance down the road. The windows were tinted, and the engine idled quietly. It had been there for the past 2 nights, and something about it didn't sit right with him. He decided to approach the vehicle, but as soon as he stepped off his property, the SUV sped away. It was clear someone was watching him, though their intentions remained unclear. Feeling increasingly cornered, Mark decided to invest in additional security measures. He installed motion-activated lights and high-definition cameras around the perimeter of the workshop. He also contacted a private security firm to conduct nightly patrols in the area. It was an expensive move, but he couldn't afford to take any chances, especially after the incident with the damaged gate. Despite the mounting stress, Mark tried to keep his mind on his work. The workshop was more than just a business, it was his passion and his livelihood, and he wasn't about to let a group of developers take that away from him. Every time he felt the weight of the situation pressing down on him, he reminded himself why he had started the workshop in the first place. He had built it with his own hands, pouring years of hard work into turning an abandoned warehouse into a thriving business. He wasn't going to let anyone take that away from him without a fight. Just when it seemed like things couldn't get worse, Chris called with unexpected news. "I've been doing some more digging," he said. "It turns out that one of the developers involved in this project has a bit of a history. They've been accused of using similar tactics in other cities, filing bogus complaints, intimidating property owners, and even bribing local officials to push through their developments." Mark felt a flicker of hope. "Can we use that against them?" "We might be able to," Chris replied. "If we can find concrete evidence linking them to Stephen's harassment, we could build a case for malicious intent. That would put them on the defensive and give us leverage." For the first time in weeks, Mark felt like they had a real chance of turning the tide. He agreed to let Chris pursue this angle, even though it meant digging deeper into the developer's operations, which could take time. In the meantime, he focused on keeping the workshop running smoothly and maintaining his composure, despite the constant pressure. As the days passed, it became clear that Stephen and the developers weren't backing down. More inspectors showed up unannounced, more complaints were filed, and the black SUV continued to make appearances near the workshop at odd hours. Mark documented every incident meticulously, knowing that each piece of evidence could be crucial in the legal battle ahead. Then one night, things took a dangerous turn. Around midnight, Mark was woken by the sound of breaking glass. He grabbed a flashlight and hurried to the front of the workshop, where he found one of the large windows shattered. A brick lay on the ground beneath the broken glass, and taped to it was another note: "Leave while you still can." Mark's heart pounded as he read the message. This was no longer just a game, it was a direct threat. He immediately called the police, who arrived shortly after and took his statement. While they promised to increase patrols in the area, Mark knew that wouldn't be enough. Whoever was behind this wasn't going to stop until they got what they wanted or until Mark forced them to back down. The next morning, Chris arrived at the workshop to discuss their next steps. "We need to take this to the next level," he said firmly. "I'm filing a motion to expedite the court case and requesting an injunction against the developers. If we can get the court to issue an order preventing them from interfering with your business, that'll give us some breathing room." Mark agreed, though he knew the fight was far from over. The developers had money, power, and influence on their side, but Mark had something they didn't: a determination to protect what was his, no matter the cost. He wasn't just fighting for his workshop anymore, he was standing up for every small business owner who had ever been bullied by those with deeper pockets and fewer scruples. As he watched Chris drive away, Mark took a deep breath, steeling himself for the battles ahead. This was his life, his work, and his legacy. He wasn't going to let anyone take it away from him without a fight. If Stephen and the developers wanted a war, they were about to find out just how far Mark Harper was willing to go. The courtroom was unusually quiet as Mark sat at the defendant's table, waiting for the hearing to begin. This wasn't just another routine legal proceeding, it was the culmination of weeks of escalating harassment, baseless complaints, and outright intimidation. Mark knew this was his best shot to put an end to the madness. Chris had worked tirelessly to prepare for this day, compiling evidence that could expose the developers' underhanded tactics and, more importantly, show that Stephen's actions were not only personal but part of a coordinated effort to force Mark out. Stephen sat across the room, flanked by two sharp-suited lawyers and radiating his usual smug confidence. He didn't look like a man concerned about the outcome of this hearing. If anything, he looked bored, as though this was just another minor obstacle he would soon sweep aside. His attitude only strengthened Mark's resolve. No matter how much money or influence Stephen and his backers had, Mark was determined to see this through to the end. As the judge entered and the hearing began, Stephen's lead attorney wasted no time launching into his argument. He portrayed Stephen as a reasonable man who had merely been exercising his right to park on what he believed was a shared access road. According to the attorney, Mark had overreacted by towing the cars without proper notice, escalating a simple misunderstanding into a legal conflict. He framed the repeated complaints and inspections as legitimate concerns raised by local residents who were unhappy with the noise and environmental impact of Mark's workshop. Mark couldn't help but feel a surge of anger as he listened to the distorted version of events. They were twisting the truth, presenting Stephen as a victim when, in reality, he had been the aggressor from the start. but he forced himself to remain calm. Chris had warned him that getting emotional would only play into their hands. This was about facts and evidence, not feelings. When it was Chris's turn to speak, he laid out their case methodically and confidently. He began by submitting the property map and lease agreement, which clearly showed that the driveway in question was private property, fully under Mark's control. He also presented photographs and timestamps showing multiple instances of Stephen's cars blocking the entrance to the workshop, disrupting business operations and causing significant inconvenience. Chris emphasized that Mark had given Stephen numerous warnings before resorting to towing, which was well within his legal rights as the property owner. Next, Chris shifted his focus to the broader context of the conflict. He introduced the development proposal that Mark had discovered, pointing out that Stephen had a financial interest in the project and stood to benefit directly if Mark's workshop was forced to close. This was where things got interesting. Chris revealed the existence of the investment group that Stephen was a partner in an entity formed specifically to facilitate the redevelopment of the industrial zone. He submitted the business registry documents as evidence, drawing a clear line between Stephen's actions and the developer's attempts to acquire Mark's property. As Chris spoke, Mark noticed a change in Stephen's demeanor. The smug confidence began to fade, replaced by a flicker of unease. It was clear that they hadn't expected Mark and Chris to uncover this connection. Stephen's attorneys tried to object, arguing that the development plans were irrelevant to the case, but the judge allowed Chris to continue. He concluded by stating that Stephen's repeated harassment, combined with the developer's aggressive tactics, constituted a coordinated effort to force Mark out of his rightful place of business. After presenting their case, Chris called a surprise witness, a former employee of one of the developers involved in the project. The man testified, under oath, that he had been present at several meetings where Stephen and the developers discussed strategies to pressure local business owners into selling their properties. According to his testimony, the plan had always been to use legal pressure, complaints, and inspections to wear down resistance until the businesses either sold out or shut down. This testimony was a game changer. Stephen's lawyers scrambled to discredit the witness, but the damage was done. The judge listened intently, taking notes as the witness described in detail how the developers had coordinated their efforts. By the time the testimony ended, it was clear to everyone in the courtroom that this was no longer just a petty neighborly dispute. It was something much larger and more calculated. In his closing argument, Chris drove the point home. He urged the court to recognize that Mark had acted within his rights as a property owner, and that the real issue at hand was the developer's attempt to use underhanded tactics to seize valuable land. He requested that the court not only dismiss Stephen's lawsuit but also issue an injunction preventing further harassment and interference with Mark's business. When the judge finally adjourned the hearing and said he would deliver his decision later that afternoon, Mark felt a wave of exhaustion wash over him. The waiting was the hardest part. He had done everything he could. Now it was up to the court. Several hours later, everyone was called back into the courtroom. Mark's heart pounded as he took his seat, trying to remain composed. The judge reviewed the key points of the case before delivering his verdict. He ruled in Mark's favor, dismissing Stephen's claims and ordering him to pay all legal costs. More importantly, the judge issued an injunction against Stephen and the developers, prohibiting any further attempts to interfere with Mark's business. As the judge finished speaking, Mark felt an overwhelming sense of relief. It was finally over. Stephen sat silently, his expression unreadable, while his lawyers packed up their papers in tense silence. Mark knew that while this was a significant victory, it didn't mean the developers would give up entirely. But for now, he had bought himself time and secured his right to continue operating his workshop without fear of constant harassment. Outside the courthouse, Mark shook Chris's hand firmly. "I don't know how to thank you," he said sincerely. "You don't have to," Chris replied with a grin. "You stood your ground and didn't let them push you around. You did most of the hard work. I just made sure the law was on your side." As Mark drove back to his workshop, he allowed himself a rare moment of quiet satisfaction. He had faced down a powerful adversary and won, not just for himself but for every small business owner who had ever been bullied by those with more money and influence. It hadn't been easy. and there were moments when he had questioned whether it was worth the fight, but in the end he had stood up for what was right, and that made all the difference. Back at the workshop, Mark opened the gates and stepped inside. The familiar scent of motor oil and metal filled the air, grounding him in the present. There was still work to be done, clients to serve, and cars to restore. But now, for the first time in weeks, he could focus entirely on what he loved without the shadow of harassment looming over him. This wasn't just a victory, it was a new beginning. Mark knew the road ahead wouldn't always be smooth, but he was ready for whatever came next. After all, he had learned something important through this ordeal. When you stand your ground and fight for what matters, you can weather any storm. The days following the court's ruling were quieter than Mark had expected. After weeks of relentless pressure, harassment, and escalating threats, the absence of Stephen's interference almost felt strange. For the first time in what seemed like forever, Mark could open his workshop in the morning without worrying about inspectors, complaints, or broken gates. The injunction issued by the court had worked. Stephen and the developers had been legally barred from further harassment, and any violation of that order would carry severe penalties. While Mark knew it was unlikely they would give up entirely, for now he had some breathing room. Despite the calm, Mark remained cautious. He doubled down on security, ensuring the cameras around the workshop were always recording and keeping close contact with Chris in case anything new developed. He had learned a hard lesson over the past few weeks. People like Stephen and the developers didn't back down easily, and they would only look for subtler, more indirect ways to apply pressure. Meanwhile, news of the court victory spread quickly among the local business owners. Several of them visited Mark personally to offer their congratulations and express their relief. Many had been quietly following his case, worried that if he lost, they would be next. Mark's win had given them hope. He realized that, without intending to, he had become something of a symbol for the small business owners in the area, a reminder that standing up to powerful interests was possible, even when the odds seemed stacked against you. It didn't take long for the developers to make a new move, albeit one far less aggressive than before. A week after the ruling, Mark received an official offer from them to buy his workshop, this time, through legitimate channels. The offer was generous, significantly above market value, and came with promises of support in relocating his business to a new, more modern facility. Mark didn't even have to think about it. He politely declined, informing them that he had no intention of selling. "You think that's the last we'll hear from them?" Mark asked Chris later that day. Chris chuckled. "Probably not. But they've realized they can't bully you out of here. Now they're trying to sweeten the deal. Just stay alert, and if they come back with anything else, let me know." Mark took that advice to heart, but for now he was content to focus on his work. His clients continued to show their support, bringing in new projects and spreading the word about his workshop. Business was better than ever, and with the legal troubles behind him, Mark finally had the peace of mind to enjoy what he did best: restoring classic cars and bringing them back to life. One evening, as he closed up for the day, he stood outside the workshop and took a long look at the building. The place was more than just a business, it was the culmination of years of hard work, sacrifice, and passion. It was a symbol of everything he had built from the ground up, and he wasn't about to let anyone take it away from him. The past few weeks had been a test, but they had also strengthened his resolve. He had stood his ground, fought for what was his, and come out stronger on the other side. As he turned to lock the gate, he noticed a familiar face approaching, one of the local business owners who had stopped by earlier. The man smiled and extended his hand. "A few of us were talking," he said. "We're thinking of forming a business association, something informal, just to keep an eye on things and make sure what happened to you doesn't happen to anyone else. We'd love for you to be part of it." Mark shook the man's hand firmly. "Count me in," he said. "If we stick together, they won't be able to pull this kind of stunt again." That night, Mark sat on his porch with a cold beer in hand, reflecting on everything that had happened. The battle had been exhausting, and there were moments when he had felt like giving up. But in the end, he had proven that resilience and determination could stand up to even the most powerful adversaries. It hadn't been easy, and there were still challenges ahead, but for the first time in weeks, Mark felt a sense of peace. This wasn't just a story of one man standing up for his workshop, it was a story of refusing to be pushed around, of knowing when to fight and when to hold your ground. And if the developers ever tried anything again, Mark would be ready. After all, he hadn't just survived the storm, he had come out of it stronger, more determined than ever to protect what was his. As the night grew darker and the lights of the workshop glowed softly in the distance, Mark smiled to himself. This was his home, his business, and his dream, and no one was going to take it away.